Alright friends, we have talked about the basics of technical communication. So let's go to the first block, the first step, which is analyze the audience. So let's talk a little bit about audience analysis in detail. What are we going to do in this session today? We are going to talk about importance of audience. We'll define the audience of a document. Then we'll see how we can group the audience and then cater to their needs, or how can we adapt our content to suit the audience's requirements. So who's the audience? If you recall the communication model that we talked about, we said that there is a sender and there is a receiver. We also mentioned that the sender and a receiver, they both have frames of references, and then these frames should have an overlap. As a sender, as a writer, you are the communicator. So you'll have to make the effort of finding out what is a frame of reference of the receiver. Receiver of communication in your case is going to be the target audience, or people who are going to read documents that you are going to write. So you should know what is their frame of reference and then communicate in that particular frame of reference. Something very interesting, and I'm sure this must be happening in your house or maybe around your house with your neighbors, friends, families and so on. I was talking to my daughter the other day, and I was surprised that I told her the same thing, maybe something like 4 or 5 times, but she failed to understand. And I asked her that I'm telling you the same thing again and again 5 times, and why aren't you still doing it? That was the time when my mother-in-law came and told me that, Makaran, you are telling her in the language that you understand. Now you have to consider that you are talking to a child who is 6 years old, and you will have to talk in the language that the child can understand. Many times we communicate the way we can communicate and not the way the audience can understand. We try to do things which we can do and not the things that the audience will be able to follow. So we tend to create our message, encode our message, use words which the audience may not understand. And then we communicate, and on top of that we also hold the audience responsible for not being able to understand it. When you are writing technical documents, it is you who is communicating to the reader. So the reader is the receiver and you are the sender of the communication. In most cases, the reader does not come back to you, or you as in a writer, saying that I did not understand this particular paragraph, or I was not able to follow this particular procedure. What does the reader do? He doesn't have many options. He simply shuts the book and tries to find another solution for his requirements. He stops reading books. I'm sure this has happened to all of you. You must be operating a gadget or a product, maybe a mobile phone, maybe your DVD player, maybe your TV, and you are trying to do something which is slightly complex, which is not a day-to-day task, and you find it very difficult to attain. Then you remember of the user guide. You go ahead and you open that guide only to realize that whatever is written over there, either you are not able to follow it or it is technically inaccurate. What do you do in such cases? You simply keep the book aside and you talk to somebody who can help you out with the problem at hand. You take help either at personal level or at professional level so that the task gets completed. But you don't refer to documentation once you have realized it's not catering to your requirements. So a feedback does not come to a writer, but then the audience's needs are not being fulfilled. You'll need to notice a number of things about your target audience. For example, let us look at the slide and note these points. You'll need to analyze the audience. You'll need to know who is the audience. What does your audience expect of this particular document? You will need to find out what is the audience's existing level of understanding or existing level of knowledge about the subject or product that you are talking about. You will need to know what are the demographics, what is the background, how much is the education, what is the age, and so on of the target audience of your particular document. You will need to find out what are the interests of that audience. Many technical writers simply write, they don't draw. They think their profession is technical writing, quote unquote. So it's only writing that they are supposed to do. They are not drawing any diagrams. Still, let me tell you that if I give you a 200-page document and the document, let's say, has only 3 diagrams, tell me what will you read first? You are going to read the diagrams first, and that's because diagram is something that intrigues your interest, that pushes or triggers your thinking, that attracts your attention, and then you start reading from the diagram, and then maybe you turn on to the text. So many times we simply write instead of drawing, giving illustrations, giving flowcharts, or giving diagrams. My own thumb rule is, if I am writing a document, I make sure that there is at least one diagram of any sort. Of course, when I say any sort, it should be of the nature that appropriately represents that particular information. But every 5 pages, I try to put at least one diagram. And it's not a bad idea to put one diagram on every page. If you are writing software documentation, computer software documentation, you may need to insert screenshots. So the user will be actually able to see the application interface in front of them while they are reading the instructions. This will lead to a complete understanding of the product and its usage. So you'll need to find out this about the audience. What are the interest levels? How does the audience like to read? You cannot talk to a kid, maybe a child of 6 years of age, in a language in which you can talk to adults. You should not talk to a teenager in a language that you talk to a 6-year-old child, because they'll feel offended. You'll need to find out about the education, the needs of the audience. Why is the audience reading this particular document? And then customization. Now this is precisely the point that we discussed earlier, which is look at the audience and then encode your message likewise. If you are talking to a child, encode it likewise in a language that a child can understand. Talking to a teenager, use the words that a teenager can understand. Talking to adults or professionals, use the words they can understand. Talking to engineers, use the proper technical terms. If you try to take a workaround, the audience may actually get confused. Let's now try to identify different categories of audience, or let's try to at least differentiate them in a few generic categories which you could use across different range of products. Now these categories are generic and hence can be adapted to different range of products and services. They may not necessarily be related to age, but we are defining them either by usage or by virtue of experience. So let's go ahead and take a look at these categories. You see 3 categories on the slide: beginners or novice, competent or intermediate, and finally the experts. These people read documentation, their reading patterns, their expectations are different. I could be a novice when it comes to one subject, and I could be an expert when it comes to another subject. But when I am a novice in a particular subject, my expectations from the documentation of that particular subject is going to be different. So let's go ahead and take a look at each of them, each of these categories. So first, let us talk about the beginners or the novice users. Let us look at the slide now. Novice users may have no or very limited hands-on experience on the product. They may have some basic knowledge of the subject or the product. They may have probably seen a demo of the product, and they may also have used the product occasionally. They may not have worked on the product for longer duration of time. Let's go to the next slide. What content will you give to novice users? Let's focus on the slide. First of all, don't make any assumptions about novice users' knowledge. It's a good idea to assume that they don't know much and explain to them some of the very basic concepts, some of the very basic specific terminology of the subject that you are talking about. So use simple language, but technical terms only where appropriate with explanation. Use direct and imperative sentences. Include illustrations, schematics, snapshots, graphics, and so on to explain the information. Provide definitions wherever required. Whenever you are using a technical term, you should give a definition. Provide a glossary so that they can easily search for the terms and the explanation. Add cross references to other parts of the document so that they can cross refer. So you can say at the end of procedure 1, for more information or for next steps, refer to page number 7, procedure number 7. Give examples to make the theory interesting. Novice users may prefer to read examples and then use them as a tool to understand the theory. An expert user on the other hand may simply understand the theory just like that and may ask you to cut the examples and deliver more in the given time. Let's go ahead with the next slide. Intermediate users have used the software or the product earlier, maybe more than once. Intermediate users may have good technological awareness, quote unquote, or maybe technological skills in a few cases. Intermediate users could be competent in using most of the commonly used functions. Now you can take your own example. If you have been using mobile phones for 2 or 3 years, you buy any other new mobile or any new handset, you will still be able to make and receive calls without any difficulty. You will be able to insert the battery, insert the card, charge the battery, make a phone call, send a SMS. But if it comes to creating, maybe recording sound, recording video, or even sending a MMS, then you may need some help. So such users are categorized as the intermediate users. Let's look at what content will deliver to intermediate users. For intermediate users, you should use technical terms wherever they are appropriate. You should use direct and imperative sentences. Once again, you should include graphics wherever required and provide cross references also for easy reference. You will need to give examples of concepts which are difficult to understand or theories which are difficult to understand. Let's now talk about the expert users. So let's go to the next slide. Let's focus on the slide. Expert users have excellent knowledge of the product and they know how to use it. Expert users most of the times would know the subject and product to a great extent. Expert users know the strengths and weaknesses of the product as well. Expert users are competent in using most of the features they use. Expert users in most cases have technical and practical knowledge of the subject and even the product. So what kind of content will you deliver to expert users? Let's look at that. Content for expert users include graphics where it is absolutely required. You need not use graphics for concepts that they already know. You should add more technical information than giving elementary information. Try and avoid giving examples for some of the very basic level concepts because they already know. Instead, they might expect you to give some advanced level information which could have a good reference value. You may have to give names of books or websites which can guide them, or you may have to tell them how to use some of the features in combination with some other product. This is the type of information that expert users will probably use. Sometimes we create different documents for novice, intermediate and expert users. We create something called as a quick reference guide. A quick reference guide, though equally useful to all of them, but is mostly used by intermediate users and maybe to some extent by expert users. Novice users will probably read the entire manual for the first time and then they'll start using the quick reference guide. So depending on your audience, you'll have to decide how you are going to communicate with that audience. While doing the audience analysis, there are some questions that you will need to answer. You should ask those questions to yourselves when you are designing the document. These questions will try and understand the requirements from the documentation in further detail. Now let's quickly take a look at these questions. So let's focus on the slide. Why should the document be written in the first place? What is that the readers already knows, or what is the reader's existing knowledge base? Why and when will the reader refer to this document? What language does the reader understand? What does the reader want to know? How much time does the reader have? How will the reader read this document? What can be done to minimize the time taken by the reader to find the required information? What are the reader's sensitivities and biases? Answers to all these questions are going to give you a lot of information that will be useful in designing the document. You should try and minimize the time taken by readers to access the information. For this, you are going to put multiple things in the document. You are going to put table of contents, list of figures, list of tables, index at the end of the document. You are also going to provide cross references and headers and footers. All this will ensure that the reader will get to the information in the minimum possible time. You should be able to identify what type of language you want to use. Are you going to use UK English, US English, Indian English, or are you going to use any other Indian regional language? You should be able to know whether the reader is very sensitive about usage of certain words. When we are talking about international level documentation, there are some biases which we try to avoid. What are the reader's sensitivities and biases? While writing documentation of the international standard, you will have to be very careful. You will have to ensure that you don't use what is called as the sexist language, or you don't use words like his or her in the document. Many times writers write sentences like the user should use his and so on. So here we are making an assumption that the user is a male user. That may not always be true. So in such cases, you will have to phrase sentences in such a way that they are gender neutral. We will talk more about this when we go to writing and reviewing. Let us go to the next slide now. Once you have identified the users, you will need to adapt to their preferences. How will we do this? Let's focus on the slide. What is the role played by the audience while using this product? For example, let's say you are writing the documentation of a banking software. So you may actually end up writing different documents for different roles of different users in that particular bank. You may write a different guide for managers. You may write a different guide for tasks to be done by accountant, which will be exclusively for accountants. You may write a different manual which contain tasks to be performed by a cashier, and so on and so forth. So you will need to identify whether this user or this group of user plays a particular role while using the application. Depending on that, you may decide to structure your document, or you may actually write separate documents. Let's look at the next point on the slide. You will have to decide the presentation and organization of the information. You will need to decide how much information is to be included and what can be excluded. What are the details to be included? You will have to decide how subjective, objective and informative the information that you are giving is going to be. You may want to avoid unnecessary subjective information. You may just want to give only sufficient information so that the user is able to do the task at hand. You will have to identify what is that you can assume. For example, if you are writing, as we talked about it earlier, if you are writing for a banking software, you will need to assume that a person who is working on this particular application is already working in a bank. So he would know information like accounts, types of accounts, opening an account, closing an account, approval of an account opening, approval before closing an account, and so on. You may not want to explain banking to this particular user. You may just have to explain to the user how the user can do his day-to-day tasks using the software application that you are going to give him. That concludes our discussion on audience analysis. Let us now go ahead and talk about information gathering.